Hello and welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Straight On Till Morning. The Lost Boys. Wendy followed the ferry as best as she could without becoming distracted by the details of the landscape below. Some things looked exactly as she imagined them. The savannas of the upper Hillsdale, for instance, and the multi-levels of the Tunnel Springs, but some things were subtly different and others entirely unrecognizable. Far to the northwest was the area she couldn't remember well. In reality, it turned out to be a peninsula shrouded in a heavy, gray, and vicious fog. Maybe it really is masked by the elements because it hasn't been described yet or used in a story, Wendy thought. To the south, that was strange balding mound of a hill that was just crying for an obvious name. Was it John's invention, or Michael's, or someone else's? And wait a moment, what about those someone else's? Other children? Besides me and Michael and John? Wendy suddenly wondered. Did they wake up the whole areas of the islands in their own games? And was there any part of Neverland that was just itself not prone to the stories and imaginations of children? Was this fairy with her a native, as it were, or the result of some little girl's dream? Wendy could get some answers once everything with Hook and the shadow was sorted. Luna ran far below them, disappearing into the jungles here, reappearing on her trail there, keeping an eye on the two flyers and barking at their shadows. Wendy's shadow waves insouciantly at her as she rippled over the treetops and clearings. The ferry was already descending toward the center of the island, which wasn't really that big. Despite the very obviously non-temperature flora near the beach, here the pernicious forest became solidly northern, if not hyperborean. There were pines and oaks with their surprisingly familiar leaf shapes that spoke of cool, moist shadows below. These grew alongside palms and vines and exotic flowers and the like, a mishmash of ideas. The spot in the middle of this mess was a scrubby clearing that was just sort of terrifying and very long and creepy. A giant dead tree stood in the center. Its gnarled, broken off branches and twigs were like bones grasping at the sky, as if the tree were still fighting its fate 100 years ago after its death. What looked too regular to be vines turned out, of course, to be the frayed ends of ropes and nooses, all sizes and shapes. For all sorts of necks, I suppose, Wendy said thoughtfully. The grass and weeds around the tree had been trampled into a dry brown dust by unknown activity. Standing like sentinels on the cardinal points just outside the circles were other gigantic trees. They were very much alive, almost too alive. Wendy carefully and slowly lowered herself to the ground, wobbling a bit as she went. She was hoping for a perfect graceful landing, like a Russian ballerina on one point, but had to settle for mostly on 2 flat feet stumble. She bowed forward with momentum, managing to catch herself before completely tumbling over her head. The ferry had disappeared, presumably to the hidden hideout of the Lost Boys. "Luna?" Wendy cried. "Luna?" An answering howl came from somewhere downhill and to the south. The wolf was on her way, but still far. "All right, I'll see you in a bit." She made a barefoot circle in the clearing, the weight of her dress now feeling strange as it whooshed against her leg, catching against the little hairs on her skin. She studied the trees on the perimeter carefully and was quickly rewarded for her efforts. Giant knots in their trunks had suspicious black clacks around them. Body-sized holes rose up from their roots with edges that seemed strangely smooth, as if they've been polished by constant use. "They're not actually hidden that well, are they?" she mused. Anyway, not just clever Wendy with an eye and moment's thought could tell there was something often a little too frequent about the area. Did the pirates never really find Peter Pan's hideout? Had they ever actually looked? It brought to the mind the idea of when a child plays hide-and-go-seek with his mummy and tries not to giggle while poising something behind too small to adequately camouflage him. The family dog, for instance, or a small ottoman. Wendy shrugged and primly stepped through the door, feeling just a tad superior. So she was more than a bit taken aback when the floor fell mechanically away below her, and she tumbled, heels over her head, down a hard and lumpy ramp. She landed on an equally hard floor, a mess of dress, hair and sash, legs sprang, and vision spinning. But she couldn't see enough to notice a very smug-looking fairy hovering in the over her arms crossed. "Oh, I'm really here. This is Peter Pan's hideout." "And yours too," Wendy added quickly, just as the fairy began to frown. The place was as delightful as she imagined. The cave under the hangman's tree was perfectly dry and smelled mostly fresh, with only the very slight tang of dirty little boys. The ground was even, and if it had not neatly swept, at least covered an assortment of skins and rugs. One particularly large sheepskin near the fire pit had its soft and thick fleece turned upward, showing indentation to where it was obviously slept on. Other beds were stashed willy-nilly around the cave, some nestled in its hollows made in the walls themselves, some in the cradling arms of gigantic roots that struck through the ceiling. Some were hammocks hanging from those same roots. There's a few civilized details, like the chairs that looked like as though they had been purloined for more modern and elegant domiciles. A red velvet recliner, for instance, which would have been far more at home in Mr. Darling's club than at a cave. Wherever did that come from, Wendy wondered. But for the rest of the furniture, consisting primarily of things like barrels cut in half, with moss for cushions, and the stumps of trees with hastily hammered on backs. Enormous mushrooms made for the table. Some of the lanterns were funguses as well, softly glowing bluish-green flowers that spread in delicate clumps just below the ceiling. "John would have a field day with these, I'm certain," Wendy said with a smile. One large barrel was placed under the end of a hollowed-out root to collect rainwater. There were shelves and nooks for the few possessions considered precious by lost boys. Piles of gold coins, interesting animal skeletons, shiny crystals, captivating birds and sea pods. Also, more strange detritus of the civilized world. A hinge, a pipe, a knob from a drawer, a spanner, and even a pocket watch. "Oh, this is all amazing!" Not it couldn't do a bit of a woman's touch. A proper cauldron could be hung from a chain above fire for soups and stews, for instance. The rugs could be beaten out a bit, but where was the wash tub and the out-of-place ornate frame that cleverly dilated a window could have used a nice little chintz curtain, even bright light and prying eyes out. Oh, she could do much more with it. Imagine if it was hers and all the lost boys who would take care of them, like young pirates. When struggling with the thought. In many of her stories about Neverland, she kept house for Peter, and then much like Snowbite for the dwarfs. And they revered her and promised never leave her, and always brought back the little best trinkets for their adventures. An inquisitive tinkling brought her out of reverie. "I don't know where they are," Wendy answered, thinking she had guessed the question. "I'm sure they'll be here soon." With an irritated swoop, the fairy grabbed one of her locks and pulled to the flying corner of the cave, and forcing Wendy to stumble quickly to try and avoid any pain. "You have to..." "Oh." The fairy let her go and pulled aside a piece of bright gold and pink silk hanging on the wall. Behind it was the fairy's own private room. She had a soft bed of bright green moss with several iridescent flowers for a counterpane. A shelf mushroom served as an actual shelf, displaying an assortment of dried flowers and pretty gewgaws the fairy had collected. There was a charming little dining table, somewhat bold in irony. It was cheerily but deadly red and white anemia. The white top was set with an acorn cap and jingle shell charger. In the corner, a beautifully carved green leaf collected drops from somewhere in the ceiling, much like the water barrel did, but this was obviously for discreet fairy bathing. An assortment of tiny buds, rough seeds, and spongy moss were arranged neatly on a piece of gray driftwood nearby to aid in cleansing. "Oh my," Wendy said, "this is the most beautiful flat I've ever seen." The fairy tried very hard not to look pleased. The accessories, the flowers, the furniture, it's all perfect. Maybe the fairy didn't precisely blush, but she didn't allow a single grudging smile. Wendy felt her heart leap. Maybe they were, despite the fairy's initial hatred, blown closer. Maybe. Suddenly, the cave resounded with bumps and knocks and disturbing echoes from above. The furniture, fairy and full-size, shook. "What's up?" Wendy cried. "Are we being attacked?" The fairy rolled her eyes, once again dismissive of her human companion. At first, the boy's body tumbled into view. Wendy understood. The lost boys were home. They came flying down the tunnel slides, landed neatly and unfurled like ferns of strange creatures. These were the lads Peter had rescued from orphanage and the terrible fate of growing up. In her stories, Wendy always had them wearing the skins of animals. And so they did, sort of. The first boy definitely had on a real bear skin, as real as the rug on the floor, and the animal's claws were worn over his hands like gloves. The next one, the tallest, had the tail of a fox, but he also sported the bright red coat of a traveling salesperson and a red felt hat beaten into two peaks to resemble fox ears. There was a set of twins with black gloves and black masks plastered directly on their faces below. They also had fluffy striped tails affixed in their baggy gray overalls, which they wore no shirt underneath. Scandalous, like poor street ruffians. Wendy searched her mind for what possibly could be, and they finally came up with a raccoon, a creature from the Americas that was supposed to be terribly smart and devious, but quite prim, habituated to washing its hands and food before dining. The smallest lost boy was no more than a toddler. He wore real fur, a beautiful black and white hide with a strangely pungent, but not entirely unpleasant smell. Another New World creature, a skunk. They could spray their stinking, acidic streams to deter predators. Very useful defense for so small and helpless, Wendy found herself thinking. Right in the middle of the group, neither the tallest nor the shortest, nor the fattest nor the skinniest, was an approximation of something that was not quite a rabbit. A long, very used dove gray tailcoat had an equally long black tail with a white tip on the end. A leather headband that held back short brown hair wore two long floppy gray ears. "Oh, hello," Wendy said, clapping her hands together in delight of all of them. They looked up with her surprise, but not much more. A shadow hung over them in their eyes. "Who's this, Tinkerbell?" The tall fox asked. The fairy flew down in between them and tinkled and jangled. "A Wendy? What's a Wendy?" "Oh, she is. The Wendy. I get it." While Wendy was pleased with this introduction, she felt a little slighted. She had loved fairies, always loved fairies. How come the lost boys could understand what the fairies said and she couldn't? And they even knew her name. "Pleased to meet you," Wendy said, very proudly holding her hand. The fox looked at it. "I'm Slightly," he said. He couldn't have been more than 15. There was something in his eyes that seemed both older and younger. "I'm the leader when Peter Pan's not around. This is Skipper." He gestured at the rabbit's thing, who looked away. "And these are the twins." The two raccoons bobbed their heads and grinned. "How do you do?" Wendy grinned, charmed by the way they'd acted in perfect unison. "Cubby," the bear bowed and growled. He pointed at the littlest one standing next to him. "This is Toodles. He doesn't talk much. He's a baby. A fierce baby. Don't scrap him." The skunk had started to look annoyed and sulky, but then smiled broadly, easily lulled by quick thought words of praise. "How do you do?" Wendy said, leaning forward to the little skunk. His smell was actually less offensive than what was coming off the other ones. She had to resist the urge to crinkle her nose or hide behind a scented glove, which she didn't have anyway. Slightly seemed to be the only one who bathed at all. His dark skin was free from the permanent layer of grubbiness that covered the rest of them. As with pirates, Wendy desperately wanted to scrub them with a nice boar bristle brush, starting with a fierce baby. And I'm going to stop it right there, and I'll see you later.